I will read for you Captain Underpants, another epic novel in ASMR style. ASMR Katz. Hello my beloved ASMR mouses and welcome back to my YouTube channel. I start now to read Captain Underpants and the Attack of the Talking Toilets. I already read the first novel from Dave Pilkey, and this is now the second of it. There will wait even more ahead. This book is more comic style, so I have a little bit different way to read it, and you are more than invited to join. If you not already did, feel free to subscribe to my YouTube channel. I have still my smartphone on. Do you hear that? This I have directly to change. Sometimes it happens that I don't think too much about it. So now I have to keep the focus back in track. The problem is that it's sometimes, like today, early in the morning. But I will be aware that I put my smartphone away because sometimes I make behind the scene clips for my Patreon followers, for my ManyVids followers, for my TikTok followers, Instagram followers. So it is actually necessary that I have my smartphone close by to make some little video clip behind the scene sequences. And I also have my coffee here. I drink to be able to read now a long time for you guys. Okay, back on track. Very professional now again that I ask you that you can feel free to follow and subscribe to my YouTube channel if you not already did. And always let a comment down here because every support is important, that I can do what I love and can even make more ASMR clips in the future. When you ask yourself why I have my headphones in, this is a high quality recording, so I just can recommend you to do so as well. Put the headphones in your ear and listen carefully because it is nice to relax, lean back and enjoy the sensation of ASMR. Okay, let us start. Captain Underpants and the Attack of the Talking Toilets. Another epic novel by Dave Pilkey. Hello. Before you read this book, there are some things you should know. So Harold and I have created this informative pamphlet to fill you in on the details. Please Don't let this comic fall into the wrong hands. The Top Secret Truths About Captain Underpants by George Beard and Harold Hutchins, who deny everything. Once upon a time, there were two cool kids named George and Harold. They made their own comics about a superhero named Captain Underpants. Everybody thought their comics were funny, except for their man, old principal Mr. Krupp. One time, Mr. Krupp was being mean to George and Harold, so they bought their 3D hypno ring. They hypnotized Mr. Krupp. Then they turned him into Captain Underpants. But Mr. Krupp thought he really was Captain Underpants. He jumped out of the window to fight crime. George and Harold tried to stop him, but they had to save the world first. When they got back to school, George poured water on Captain Underpants' head. He turned back into Mr. Krupp, but something was wrong. Because now, for some strange reason, every time Mr. Krupp hears somebody snap their fingers, he turns back into Captain Underpants. So whatever you do, please don't snap your fingers around Mr. Krupp. Please, please, please don't snap those fingers. This has been a public service announcement from George and Harold, who still deny everything. Chapter 1. George and Harold. This is George Beard and Harold Hutchins. George is the kid on the left with the tie and the flat top. Harold is the one on the right with the t-shirt and the bad haircut. Remember that now. Depend on who you asked. You probably hear a lot of different things about George and Harold. Their teacher, Mr. Ribble, might say that George and Harold were disrespectful and behaviorally changed. Their gym teacher, Mr. Meaner, might add that they were in serious need of major attitude adjustments. The principal, Mr. Krupp, would probably have a few more choice words to include, like sneaky and criminally mischievous, and I'll get those boys if it's the last thing I... Will you get the idea? But if you ask their parents, they probably tell you that George and Harold were smart and sweet, and very good-hearted, even if they were a bit silly at times. I'd have to agree with their parents. But even so, their silliness did get them into a lot of trouble sometimes. In fact, it once got them into so much trouble, they accidentally almost destroyed the whole planet with an army of evil, vicious-taking toilets. But before I can tell you this story, I have to tell you this story. Chapter 2. This story. One fine morning, at Jeremy Horwitz Elementary School, George and Harold had just left their 4th grade remedially PE class when they saw a big sign in the hallway. It was an announcement for the 2nd annual Invention convention. George and Harold had fond memories of last year's Invention convention, but this year convention was a bit different. The first prize winner got to be principal for the day. Wow, said George. Whoever gets to principal gets to make up all the rules for the whole day, and everybody in school has to follow those rules. We have got to win the first prize this year, exclaimed Harold. Just then, George and Harold's principal, Mr. Krupp, showed up. Aha, he shouted. I'll bet you two are up not too good. Not really, said George. We were just reading about this year's contest. Yeah, said Harold. We are going to win first prize in the contest and be principals for the day. Haha, laughed Mr. Krupp. Do you honestly think I let you two enter this year's contest after that stunt you pulled at last year's convention? George and Harold smiled and thought back to the first annual Invention convention. Chapter 3. The Flashback. It was about 1 year earlier, and all of the factually students of Jeremy Howell's elementary school had gathered in the gymnasium for what would later be known as the sticky chair incident. George and Harold stepped up to the microphone. Ladies and gentlemen, said George, Harold and I have invented something that is guaranteed to keep you all glued to your seats. Yes, said Harold, we call it glue. Mr. Krupp became very angry. You two did not invent glue, he shouted. He stood up to take the microphone away from Harold, and this chair stood up with him. Everyone in the gymnasium laughed. The school secretary, Miss Antrophy, stood up to help remove Mr. Krupp's chair from those trousers. Her chair stood up with her too. Everyone in the gymnasium laughed harder. The other teachers stood up, and you guessed it, they were stuck to their chairs as well. Everyone in the audience howled laughter. One kid stood up to go to the toilet, and his chair came up with him also. The audience stopped laughing. They all quickly checked their chairs. Suddenly the laughter stopped completely. Everyone in the whole school was glued to their seats. You see, while it was true that George and Harold had not invented glue, they had invented a new kind of glue. By simply mixing putty with concentrated orange juice mix, they had created a quickly drying body head activity glue. Then they had applied the special glue to every seat in the gymnasium, except theirs, early that morning. Everybody in the gymnasium was glaring at George and Harold, seething with anger. I've got an idea, said George. What? Asked Harold. Run! George and Harold were grinning from ear to ear, remembering their silly invention and the chaos that followed. That was so hilarious, laughed Harold. Yeah, chuckled George. It'd be hard to top that this year. Well, you won't get a chance this year, said Mr. Krupp. He took out a magnificent glass and held it up to the fine print of the sign. This contest is open to all students in the 3rd and 4th grades, except George Beard and Hello Hutchins. You mean we can't enter the contest? Asked Harold. It's worse than that, laughed Mr. Krupp. You boys can't even attend this year's convention. I'm putting you two in study hall that whole day." Mr. Crab turned and walked away, law of him victoriously. "Rats," said Harold. "What we are going to do now?" "Well," said George, "you know that the old saying, if you can't join them, beat him." Chapter 4. The Invention. Early that evening, George and Harold sneaked back to school with their supplies. They crept into the gymnasium and peeked around. "I think somebody's still in here," whispered Harold. "Oh, it's just Melvin Sneedly," said George. Melvin was the school brainiac. He was busy putting some last-minute touches on his new invention for the contest. "We should wait here until he leaves," whispered Harold. "No way," said George. "He could be here all night. Let's just go over and talk to him." When Melvin saw George and Harold approaching, he was not happy. "Oh no," he said. "I bet you guys are here to mess with everybody's inventions." "Nice guess," said George. "Listen, we'll promise not to mess with your invention if you promise not to tell anybody that you saw us here tonight." Melvin looked lovingly at his invention and reluctantly agreed. "I promise," he said. "Great," said George. "What is that invention of yours anyway?" "It just looks like a photocopy machine." "Well, it used to be a photocopy machine," said Melvin, "but I've made some major adjustments to it. Now it is an invention that will revolutionize the world. I call it the Patsy 2000. "It will revolutionize the world, and you named it Patsy?" asked Harold. "Yes," said Melvin. "Patsy is an acronym for Photo-Automatic Transmogulating." "I'm sorry I asked," said Harold. "Allow me to demonstrate," said Melvin. "The Patsy 2000 can take any one-dimensional image and create a living, breathing 3D dimensional copy of the image. For example, take this ordinary photograph of a mouse." Melvin placed a photo of the mouse on the glass screen of the Patsy 2000 and pressed start. The lights and the gymnasium dimmed as all the power in the entire school seemed to get sucked into the Patsy 2000. Soon, the machine began to vibrate and hum loudly, and tiny balls of static electricity snapped out from underneath. "I hope that thing doesn't explode," said Harold. "Oh, this is nothing," said Melvin. "You should have seen how the Patsy 2000 reacted when I copied a poodle." Finally, after a series of flashes and loud zaps, everything stopped. A small ding was heard. Then a tiny mouse crawled out of the side door of the Patsy 2000 and onto the floor. "Isn't it wonderful?" exclaimed Melvin. George inspected the mouse closely. "That is great." George laughed. "You really had me going for a while." "It's not a trick," cried Melvin. "The Patsy 2000 really does bring photos to life. I've even created living creatures from paintings and drawings." "Yeah, right," laughed Harold. "And I thought we were con artists." George and Harold walked away, chuckling. It was time to move on to the bigger and better things. Chapter 5. Bigger and Better Things. George and Harold went to the other end of the gymnasium, opened their backpacks and began to work. George busied himself by trying all the spray snoozles on the automatic dog washer around, while Harold filled up the soap tank with India ink. Then they moved on the volcano detector. Will you please pass me the big bag of butterscotch pudding and the Phillips head screwdriver? Asked Harold. Sure, said George, as he carefully inserted eggs into the electric ping-pong ball server. Chapter 6. The Invention Convention. The following day started out sunny and cheerful. The student and teachers filed into the gymnasium and checked their seats very carefully before sitting down. Greetings, said Mr. Scrub, who was standing up at the microphone. You don't need to worry about sticky seats today, he said. I've taken measures to ensure that this invention convention won't be a disaster like the last year. Everyone settled in as Madison McKinney, a third grader, stepped on stage to demonstrate her automatic dog washer. First, said Madison, you put your dog in the tube. Then you press this button. Madison pressed the start button. At first, nothing happened. Then, suddenly a spurt of inky black water sprayed up and out over the crowd. Everyone except the dog got soaked as Madison tried desperately to turn off the sprayers. I can't stop it, she cried. Someone turned all the nozzles around. Now, who could have done that? Asked Mr. Scrub. Next up was Donny Schaumeyer. With his electric ping-pong ball server, he turned the machine on and immediately it began hurling extra large grade R eggs into the crowd. Whoop, whoop, whoop went the machine. Split, splat, splat went the eggs. I can turn the machine off, cried Donny. Somebody jammed the paper clip into the controller. Now, who couldn't done that? Asked Mr. Ribble. Freddie Moore's volcano detector was also a big flop. When Freddie connected the circuits to the 9-volt battery, a large spring, which had been crammed into the center of his miniature volcano, launched a giant plastic bag of butterscotch pudding high into the crowd. It landed however, between the third and the fourth row. Splash! Hey, whined Freddie, somebody put a pudding in my volcano. Now, who could done that? Asked Mr. Maynard. The rest of the day went on much the same way, with people shouting everything from, Hey, who put oatmeal in my solar powder leaf blower? To, Hey, who let all the mice out of my treadmill done buggy? It wasn't longer before everyone fled the gymnasium and the second annual Invention Convention had to be called off. How could this happen? Cried Mr. Crop as he whipped chocolate syrup, pencil shavings and cream of mushroom soup off his face and shirt. George and Harold have been in study hall all day long. I put them there myself. Excuse me, Mr. Crab, said Melvin neatly. I think I have an answer to your question. Chapter 7. Busted. Crash went the door to the study hall room. Mr. Crump stomped on like a crazy person. George and Harold had never seen him this upset before. You boys are in so much trouble, Mr. Scrub shouted. I'm putting you two on permanent detain for the rest of the school year. Wait a second, cried George. You can't prove anything. Yeah, said Harold. We've been here all day. Mr. Crub smiled devilish and looked toward the door. Oh, Melvin, he called. Melvin neatly stepped into the room, covered in mustard eggshell and shredded coconut. "They did it," Melvin said, pointing at George and Harold. "I saw them last night in the gym." "Melvin," cried George, horrified. "You promised." "I changed my mind," Melvin said, grinning smugly. "I have fun in detention." Chapter 8. The Invention Convention Detention. After school, Mr. Crab ushered George and Harold into the detention room and wrote a long sentence on the chalkboard. "From now on," growled Mr. Crab, "you boys will spend 2 hours a day after school copying this sentence over and over. I want every chalkboard in this room filled completely." On his way out of the door, Mr. Crab turned and said with an evil grin, "And if either of you leave this room for any reason, I'm going to suspend you both." Now, as you might have guessed, writing sentences was nothing new to George and Harold. The 2 boys waited until Mr. Crab left the room. Then they each took 4 homemade wooden roots out of their backpacks. The roots had holes in that George and Harold had drilled in George's dad's workshop. George screwed the roots together while Harold inserted a piece of chalk into each hole. Then they each took a pole and began copying Mr. Crab's sentence. Every time they wrote 1 sentence, the wooden poles made 12. After about 3.5 minutes, every chalkboard in the room was completely filled. George and Harold sat down and admired their work. "We've got a lot of time on our hands now," said George. "Got any ideas?" "Let's make a new comic book," said Harold. So the 2 boys took out some paper and pens and created an all-new adventure about their favorite superhero. It was called Captain Underpants and the Attack of the Talking Toilets. Chapter 9. Captain Underpants and the Attack of the Talking Toilets. One day at school, everything was pretty normal. The lunch ladies were serving 2 toasted red sandwiches. The principal was yelling, and the gym teacher was being mean to everybody. Then a UFO appeared. It zapped the school with evil ray. The ray made all of the toilets come to life. It made them evil too. The toilets were hungry, so they ate the gym teacher. Help! The toilet just scratched somebody's car and ate up the gym teacher. Lord have mercy. Was it my car? This looks like a job for Captain Underpants. Captain Underpants ran to the storage room. He found a bunch of plungers. He put them into the toilets, and their mouths got stuck. Hooray, Captain Underpants! Now, to stop that devil UFO. Captain Underpants went outside and saw the UFO. It opened up, and out jumped the terrible Turbo Toilet 2000. I will flush you. They had a big fight. Captain Underpants was faster than a speeding waistband, more powerful than boxer shorts, and able to leap the tall buildings without getting a wedgie. Captain Underpants snuck up behind the turbo toilet in 2000 and gave him a wedgie. Wedgie power! Then he hung the 2000 on a stop sign and pulled back hard. Then he let go. Kaboom! The spaceship blew up and all the toilets returned to normal. Even the gym teacher escaped. Chapter 10. A Big Mistake. George and Harold sat together in the detain room, reading through their newest comic book and beaming proudly. "We've got to go to the office and make copies of this," said George, "so we can sell them on the playground tomorrow." "We can't," said Harold. "Don't you remember? Mr. Krabs said he'd suspend us if he caught us leaving this room." "Then we won't let him catch us," said George. George and Harold sneaked out of the room quietly and crawled down the hall to the office. "Ooh," said Harold, "there's a bunch of teachers in there. We never get to use the copy machine." Said George. "Are there any other copy machines in the school?" "How about the one that Malvin had in the gym?" asked Harold. "Oh yeah," said George. George and Harold crept over to the gym and found the Pepsi 2000. "I wonder if this machine still makes copies," said Harold. "Melvin did say that he had made some adjustments to it." "Oh, he probably just crammed a mouse in there to fool us," said George. "It's the oldest trick in the book. I'm sure the machine still makes normal copies." George placed the cover of the new comic book face down on the glass screen and pressed start. All at once, the lights in the whole school dimmed and the Pepsi 2000 began to shake and clunk around wildly. Giant walls of static electricity zapped out the bottom of the machine as a great whirlwind rose from the top. Loose papers and other small objects in the room were sucked into the wind, and they spun above the machine like a racing cyclone. "I don't think it's supposed to do this," shouted George over the horrible noise. Finally, after a series of flashes and loud zaps, the noise, wind, and sparks stopped altogether. The only sound that could be heard was of something groaning and clawing about inside the bloated battery frame of the Pepsi 2000. "It sounds like something alive inside there," said Harold. George snatched the comic book from the top of the machine. "Let's get out of here," he cried. Just then, a small ding was heard and a full-sized shiny white toilet emerged from the side of the Pepsi 2000. Its teeth were sharp and jagged, and its angry eyeballs glowed with the red, swelling veins. "Yum, yum, eat 'em up," cried the evil toilet. Almost immediately, another talking toilet emerged, followed by another and another and another. "Yum, yum, eat 'em up," they cried. "Oh no, Melvin was right. The photoatomic Zombulating really does create living, breathing, three-dimensional copies of one-dimensional images. Harold cried convulsively. I've got an idea, said George. What? Asked Harold. Run, cried George. Chapter 11. The Invention, Convention, Detention, Suspension. George and Harold screamed and ran through the gym door, closing it tightly behind them. Ah, ha, yelled Mr. Crab, who was just coming down the hall. You boys left the detention room. You know what that means, don't you? It wasn't our fault, cried Harold. Too bad, Mr. Crab shouted with delight. You boys are officially suspended. Wait, cried George. You've got to listen. Behind this door is an army of evil witches talk. I don't have to listen to you boys ever again, laughed Mr. Crab. Now, get our stuff and get out of the school. But, Harold stammered. You don't understand. Get out, Mr. Crab screamed. George and Harold groaned and walked to their lockers to collect their stuff. Gosh, said Harold. In one day we've have detained, suspended, and we've created an army of evil talking toilets who want to take over the world. That's a pretty bad day, even by our standards, said George. Oh well, said Harold. I just hope that things don't get any worse. Chapter 12. Things get worse. Word spread quickly throughout the office that George and Harold had been suspended. The teachers rushed out of the chair and laughed at the two boys. You're in big trouble now, chuckled Miss Antrophy. I can't wait to call your parents and tell them the news. Let's take their desks outside and chop them up, cried Miss Ribble. Let's throw a party in the gym, shouted Mr. Mina. No, cried George. Whatever you do, don't open the door to the gym. We can do whatever we like, snarled Mr. Mina as he dashed over the gymnasium door. Look, I'm opening the door. He quickly opened the gym door. Now I'm closing the door, he said. Now I'm opening the door again, and now I'm... Ah! An evil toilet had stuck its mouth through the door, snapped Mr. Mina up and swallowed him whole. Flush! The talking toilets then pushed their way through an open gymnasium door and spilled out into the hallway. Yum, yum, eat them up, the toilets bellowed. The teachers couldn't believe their eyes. They screamed and ran for their lives. Only Mr. Crab, Mrs. Ribble, and George and Harold remained frozen in fear. They watched paralyzed as the talking toilets came nearer and nearer. Finally, Mrs. Ribble pointed at the toilets and snapped her fingers. Go away, she cried. Go away this minute. But the toilets didn't listen. They moved closer and closer. Finally, Mr. Ribble turned and ran. Mr. Crab, however, just stood there in daze. George and Harold looked up at him. Oh, said Harold. Did she just snap her fingers? Yep, said George. Now we're really in trouble. And George was right. For at the moment, Mr. Crab had begun to change. A silly heroic smile came over his face as he stood defiantly before his foes. I will put a stop to you vile villains, he said fearlessly. But first, I need some supplies. Mr. Crab turned and dashed to his office. George and Harold ran after him. "Why did Miss Ribble have to snap her fingers?" cried George. "Why?" Never mind that," cried George. "Mr. Crab is turning into Captain Underpants. We've got to pour water over his head before it's too late." Chapter 13. It's too late. When George and Harold reached Mr. Crab's office, they found only his clothes, shoes, and toupee on the floor. "Look," said Harold, "the window is open and one of the red curtains is missing." "What do we do now?" asked George. "Do we save Captain Underpants, or do we stay here and get eaten by a bunch of toilets?" Let me think about that once," said Harold as he climbed out of the window. George quickly collected Mr. Crab's things and shoved them into his backpack. Then he jumped out of the window after Harold. The two boys slid down the flagpole and ran off after Captain Underpants. "Where does he think he's going?" asked George. "I have no idea," said Harold. "But we better run fast, because I think we are being followed." Captain Underpants dashed through the backyards of some nearby houses and collected pairs of underwear from the clotheslines. "Mummy," said a little boy looking out his window, "a man in a red cape just stole our underwear." And now, two boys are being chased by a furious-looking toilet with sharp, pointed teeth screaming, "Yum, yum, eat them up." "Yeah, right," laughed his mother. "Just how gullible do you think I am?" Chapter 14. The Talking Toilet Takeover. When Captain Underpants had finished commandeering the underwear of local civilians, he dashed back to Jeremy Horvitz Elementary School to save the day. The school was now overrun with chaos. Mrs. Ribble came tearing out of the door, followed by several evil toilets. "Help me," she cried. "They swallowed every teacher in the whole building except me." "Don't worry, Mayhem. I won't let them eat you up," Captain Underpants said as a toilet ate her up. "Oops," said Captain Underpants. Now only George, Harold, and Captain Underpants were left. They stood on the front lawn of the school, completely surrounded by hungry, drooling toilets. "Yum, yum, eat them up," the talking toilets chanted. "We are doomed," cried Harold. "Never underestimate the power of underwear," cried Captain Underpants as he stretched and shot underwear into the waiting mouths of the talking toilets. Unfortunately, the toilets just swallowed the underwear whole, and it only seemed to make them hungrier and hungrier. If only we could think of something that would make them really sick," said George. "Yeah," Harold continued, "something so vile and disgusting it would make them all blow their guts and write in agony." Suddenly, George and Harold's faces lifted up. The cafeteria food," they shouted. And faster than a speeding waistband, our three heroes dashed into the school. Chapter 15. Creamed minced beef to the rescue. George, Harold, and Captain Underpants got inside the school safely and closed the front door behind them. "I think the toilets are all outside," said George. "But not for long," said Harold. Quickly, They ran to the school's kitchen and discovered a cart holding a large vat of something green and sludgy. "Ugh," said George, holding his nose. "What is that stuff?" "I think it's tomorrow's lunch," said Harold. "Perfect," said George. "I never thought I'd be glad to see creamed minced beef." Together, they wheeled the tub of stinky green glop down the hallway and through the side door of the school. Captain Underpants sat on the cart and stretched a pair of underwear over his head like a slingshot. George stood over him, scooped some cafeteria food into the underwear and stretched it back. Harold wheeled the cart towards the talking toilets. "Tra-la-la!" shouted Captain Underpants loudly. The talking toilets turned and saw our 3 heroes. All at once they shouted, "Yum yum, eat them up," and the chase was on. Harold pulled the cart across the playground as the toilet zipped after them. "Fire on!" cried Captain Underpants. George shoot a glob of creamed minced beef into the first toilet's mouth. The toilet swallowed it whole. Harold kept pulling as George scooped another serving into the underwear and pulled it back. "Fire too!" cried Captain Underpants. Zip went the cafeteria food right into the second toilet's mouth. The whole process repeated itself until every last toilet had swallowed at least 2 servings of creamed minced beef. "We are almost out of ammo," Captain Underpants shouted. "And I don't think I can run anymore," said Harold, huffing and puffing. "Don't worry. Look," said George, pointing at the toilets. They had all swallowed down and were beginning to groan and wobbly around. Their eyes crossed and they turned an odd shade of green. "Look out," cried Harold. "I think they're gonna hurl." And that just what they did. George, Harold, and Captain Underpants watched as the toilets chucked up everything they had eaten during the day. The creamed minced beef, the underwear even, the teachers all came out without a scratch. Then the toilet spun around in small circles and fell to the ground, dead. George checked the teachers. "They are alive," he said. "Unconscious, but alive." "Wow," said Harold. "That was easy." "Too easy," said George. "What do you mean?" asked Harold. George pulled the comic book out of his backpack and showed it to Harold. "Remember how the Patsy 2000 turned everything on the front cover of our comic book to life?" he asked. "Yeah, so?" said Harold. "Well," said George, as he pointed to the Turbo Toilet 2000 on the front cover of the comic. "We haven't seen him yet." Chapter 16. The Turbo Toilet 2000. Suddenly, the Turbo Toilet 2000 came charging out of the front door of the school with a terrible crash. The earth rumbled beneath its mighty footsteps as nearly a ton of twisting steel and raging porcelain descended upon our heroes. "You 3 meddling fools may have destroyed my army of talking toilets," screamed the Turbo Toilet 2000. "But you're all out of the cafeteria food. How are you going to stop me?" I tell you how, Captain Underpants said boldly. With veggie power. Wait, Captain Underpants, cried George. You can fight that thing. He'll rip you to pieces. Boys, said Captain Underpants nobly, I must fight valiantly for truth, justice, and all that is free, shrunk, and cottony. Captain Underpants leaped on the Turbo Toilet 2000, and the battle began. I sure hope this doesn't lead to extremely graphic violence, said Harold. Me too, said George. Chapter 17. The Extremely Graphic Violence Chapter Part 1. Warning. The following chapter contains intense scenes showing a man in his underwear battling a giant toilet. Please do not try this at home. Fliporama. In the past, literally dozens of epic novels have been written that have changed the course of history. Moby Dick, Gone with the Wind, and of course Captain Underpants and the Attack of the Talking Toilets. The only difference between our novel and those other Brand X novels is that ours is the only one that carries enough to bring you the latest in cheesy animation technique. Veggie power versus potty power. Oh no, the potty power punch prevails. Oh no! The canvas commode captures the captain. Chapter 18. Harold and the Purple Ballpoint Pen. Everything seemed hopeless. Captain Underpants had slipped and fallen into the mouth of the Turbo Toilet 2000, and now the giant toilet was coming after George and Harold. Ha 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 ha, he laughed, the powerful porcelain predator. Once I have eaten you two kids up, I will take over the world. Not if we have anything to say about it, yelled George. George and Harold ran into the school and locked the door behind them. The Turbo Toilet 2000 banged against the door with its fists shouting, "You boys can hide in there forever." George and Harold ran to the gym. "I've got a plan," said George. "We need to invent a character who can defeat a giant robot toilet." "How about a giant robot urinal?" asked Harold. "We can call it the Urinator." "No way," said George. "They never let us get away with it in a children's book. We're skating on thin ice." "All right," said Harold. "How about the giant plunger robot? He can carry a really big plunger and—" "That's it," cried George. So Harold took out the purple ball pen and began to draw. "Give him a laser eyes," said George. "All right," said Harold. "And give him turbo automatic rocket boosters," said George. "Got it," said Harold. "And make him obey our every command," said George. "I'm way ahead of you," said Harold. Harold finished his drawing, and George inspected it carefully. "This just might work," said George. "Yeah," said Harold. "If the Patsy 2000 can hold out." The boys turned and looked at the dented, cracked and beaten up machine laying on its side at the corner. George and Harold pushed the Patsy 2000 upright and dusted it off. "Come on, Patsy, old girl," said George. "We really need you now." "Yeah," said Harold. "The fate of the entire planet is in our hands." Chapter 19. The Incredible Robo-Plunger. George took Harold's picture and placed it on the screen of the Patsy 2000 and pressed start. The light around them dimmed as the wear machine began to shake and smoke. Lightning bolts zapped, thunder clapped, and the whole gymnasium shook with photoatomic transponder energy. "Come on, Patsy," George shouted over the horrible noise. "You can do it, baby." Finally, a small ding was heard, and the Patsy 2000 caught up a huge metallic behemoth. It rose up and stood valiantly before George and Harold. It was the incredible Robo-Plunger. "Hooray!" cried George. "It worked." "Way to go, Patsy," Harold cheered. "Now, let's get outside and kick some turbo toilet tushy." Chapter 20. The Extremely Graphic Violence Chapter Part 2. Notice: the following chapter contains terrible naughty scenes depicting a giant toilet getting kicked where it's shiny. All the toilet violence was carefully monitored by PET, People for the Ethical Treatment of Toilets. No, actually toilets were harmed during the making of this chapter. The incredible Robo-Plunger to the rescue. The incredible Robo-Plunger kicks the TT-2000 tushy. The TT-2000 takes the plunge. Chapter 21. The incredible Robo-Plunger had defeated the evil Turbo Toilet 2000, but George and Harold's problems weren't over yet. They reached into the crumbled mouth of TT-2000 and pulled out their principal. "What happened here?" cried Mr. Crab. "The school has been destroyed. The teachers all unconscious, and I'm standing here in my underwear." "Oh," Harold whispered, "Captain Underpants must have got to toilet water on his head." He turned back into Principal Crab. George took Mr. Crab's clothes and hair out of his backpack and handed them to him. "I'm ruined," Mr. Principal Crab whined as he dressed himself. "I'm going to be held responsible for this mess. I'm going to lose my job." "Maybe not," said George. "We can fix everything and clean up the whole mess." "Yeah," said Harold, "but it cost you." "Cost me what?" asked Mr. Crab. "Well," said George, "we like you to cancel our detained and our suspension. And we also like to be principals for the day," said Harold. "All right," Mr. Crab said. "If you can really fix everything, you got the deal." George and Harold turned and spoke to the incredible Robo-Plunger. "All right, robot guy," said George. "Make yourself useful and pick up all the mess." "Yeah, and fix up the school too," said Harold. "Use your laser eyes to repair all the broken windows and stuff. And when you're done," said George, "take all the evidence and fly it up to the Uranus. And don't come back," said Harold. Chapter 22. To make a long story short. The robot obeyed. Chapter 23. After the aftermath. The incredible Robo-Plunger soared off into space, just as the teacher began to regain consciousness. "I just had the strangest dream," said Mr. Ribble. "It was all about these evil toilets who wanted to take over the world." "We had the same dream too," said the teacher. "Well," said Mr. Crab, "things turned out all right after all." "Not quite," said George. "It's payback time." Chapter 24. Principles for the Day, or the Invention, Convention, Detention, Suspension, Prevention. "Attention, students," said George over the intercom the following day. "This is Principal George. You are all excused from classes today. There will be no homework or test, and everybody gets an A+ for the day." "That's right," said Principal Harold. "Also, we are hosting an all-day break time outside, completely with free pizza, French fries, cotton candy, and a live DJ. Now, go outside and play." Principal George and Principal Harold strolled out the playground to behold the glorious domain. George got a slice of pepperoni pizza while Harold made himself a banana split at the all-you-can-eat ice cream sundae bar. "It's good to be principal," said George. "Yep," said Harold. "I wish we could be principals every day." Later, George and Harold paid a visit to the unfunded folks who were spending the day written sentences in the detained room. All the teachers were there along with Mr. Crab and Melvin Sneely. Mr. Crab looked out of the window at the all-day break time celebration going on inside. "How are you boys going to pay for all that ice cream and pizza?" he asked. "Oh, we sold some stuff," said Harold. "What did you sell?" asked Mr. Crab. "Your antique walnut desk and leather chair," said George, "and all the furniture in the teacher's lounge." "What?" screamed Mr. Crab. "I think we better leave now," said Harold. George and Harold left the detained room in a hurry. Miss Andrew snapped her fingers at them. "Come back here right now," she yelled. "Oh no," said George. "Did Miss Androphy just snap her fingers?" Within seconds, Mr. Crab dashed out of the detained room and ran down the hall, way towards his office. He had a goofy, heroic, all too familiar-looking smile on his face. "Oh no," cried Harold. "We are go again," said George. Tra-la-la-la. All about Dave. When Dave Pelkey was in elementary school, he was always getting into trouble for pulling pranks, cracking jokes, and making silly comic books. In 2nd grade, he invented his most famous or infamous character, Captain Underpants. Dave's teacher told him, "You better straighten up, young man, because you can't spend the rest of your life making silly books." Luckily for us, Dave was not a very good listener. His Captain Underpants books are all national bestsellers and have been translated into numerous languages. This was the book Captain Underpants and the Attacking of the Talking Toilets, another epic novel by Dave Pilkey. If you not already did, then check out the first book I already read about this story. And I think nice if you like to keep focusing tracked with me together, because there will wait a lot more novels from Dave Pilkey in the future. I have to say that it's actually not that easy to read comics books instead of childhood book classics, but I try my best to keep you calm and relaxed while I will read this book. Feel free to check out all my other video clips I have in stock for you, because here on my ASMR channel it's not just about reading books. I have some food and mukbang videos and some entertaining others where I go on the adventure of sound. I have some philosophic and personal video clips waiting for you, so check out all my playlists and my full YouTube ASMR channel to see what I have to offer for you. And maybe you find something else you might like. Always feel free to comment under the video clips how you liked them and what you have for thoughts in your mind. Because with every support I can let my haul projects grow. And for me it is very important to give you a space to relax and let go and to enjoy yourself just for a moment. If you're curious about me, feel free to check out all my other pages, because I have a lot in stock. Here in the World Wide Web is my playground, and you are invited to join. Feel free to subscribe to my YouTube channel, to follow me everywhere, and to click on the notification bell. I try to upload as much as possible new ASMR free video clips for you. Thank you so much for listening, and I hope I see you very soon at the next episode.